Hello everybody, my name is Yannick Pelletier, I'm a Swiss Grandmaster, and in this video we are going to take a look at the game between Fabiano Caruana and Magnus Carlsen, played at the Grenke Chess Classic 2018 in Karlsruhe. Actually, this tournament is taking place in two different cities, the first part in Karlsruhe, the second in Baden-Baden. This is the first round, and it takes place just a few days after the end of the candidates tournament, where Caruana emerged as the winner and thus the challenger of Magnus Carlsen in the World Championship match. It's going to take place in November, and therefore a very special game. Of course, Caruana is certainly quite tired from the 14 games he has just played in Berlin, whereas Magnus Carlsen comes completely fresh. But Carlsen is also known as someone who is not always able to enter the tournament like a rocket, so quite an interesting game to witness, besides of course the whole special story and the historical background. So Caruana starts this game with d4, knight f6, c4, g6, knight f3, bishop g7, a sign that Carlsen wants to try and play a Grünfeld, and Caruana plays e3, which he has done actually 2 weeks ago in Berlin against Grishuk. Well, the main idea is to kind of prevent the Grünfeld, even though d5 is entirely possible for black here. Well, the only difference is that after c takes d5, knight takes d5, e4, there is no knight on c3 for white. He hasn't played this, so black cannot proceed to the usual exchange on c3 and get the normal counterplay. However, by playing e3 and e4 in two moves, white certainly wastes some time, and with knight b6 the position is certainly playable for black as well. Well, that's actually the idea behind the whole apparently quite passive setup of the white player. Carlsen castled here, bishop e2, and in the game I mentioned, Grishuk played c5, and then we had a Benoni pawn structure after d5, but Carlsen has certainly prepared something, and he went for just d6, knight c3, knight c6. In other words, if white wants to play King's Indian with e4, that's going to be a waste of time once again. And in a concrete opening as the King's Indian, it's certainly not good to waste a tempo. So here he's going for another setup. He plays d5 immediately, knight b4. Well, white could actually castle first here maybe, but it would allow a5, when it might be a bit more difficult for white to take space on the queen side with a3 and b4. Well, that's why Caruana played a3 immediately, knight a6, and here you cannot really play b4, not yet, because of the weakness here of the long diagonal. Therefore Caruana went knight d4, and if he could play a few other moves, then his game would be pretty easy. He'd like to play, of course he's going to castle, but he'd like to play b4, bishop b2, and prepare c5 somehow, maybe with knight b3 first. So his position would be preferable, certainly. So he went e5, which is a logical attempt here. And now a question for Caruana about the pawn structure, whether he wants to take en passant, as he did in the game, or keep the pawn structure intact. But knight b3 is perhaps the better move, but the best move, I mean, if white retreats the knight, but then it blocks the b pawn, and therefore it cannot be called an ideal move here. Well, he took on e6, f takes e6, castle e5. That's a good way to proceed for black. Knight b3 and c6, and black's position appears to be absolutely fine here. He'd like to play d5, d6, d5, of course, and well, therefore white play d4 now, knight c7, and well, Caruana also has an important decision to take, whether to continue, kind of regrouping his pieces, maybe bishop e3, sounds normal, and then putting the queen maybe to d2, rook d1, makes sense in a way, but possibly black has a special idea in mind, which, well, we can actually play those moves. Bishop e3, knight e6, queen d2, let's say, and if rook d1 can come, then white would be certainly better. But there is this typical move now, c5. It seems horrendous to allow white to put pressure on d6, this backport pawn here. But the point is, of course, that knight d4 is coming next, and this knight is just huge here. Of course, white can also play knight d5 at some point, but the difference between those two knights is quite clear. Whenever white takes on d4, for instance like this, black takes back with a pawn and creates a passed pawn here. Whereas when white plays knight d5, of course, let's admit that e4 is well protected. Just for the sake of explaining what happens after knight takes d5, white is going to take back, but there is no passed pawn, of course, because of d6. So the pawn structure here, strangely enough, perhaps, when you're not accustomed to it, is better for black. Well, that's why Caruana took measures immediately with f4, but it's not ideal either, as we're gonna see. Knight e6 anyway. f5, knight d4. Well, that's a good move. Actually, he's ready to sacrifice a pawn, but it's not easy for black. For white to take it, there will be huge compensation. So Caruana played bishop e3 simply. Knight takes e2, queen takes e2, g takes f5, pawn takes f5, and d5. And here there's this very strong pawn center. White took, as you can see, two connected passed pawn in the center. They are not vulnerable, we can't really claim that, and these pawns are ready to move forward. Right? It's not so easy yet, because whatever you move, let's say like this, then there is this hole here. If you move like this, there is this hole here, so it's not so easy for black to move these pawns. But of course, black is already very happy, and the pawn majority of white here on the queen side, on the king side, is by far not strong. So he went rook a d1, perhaps not ideal. d4, bishop g5, queen b6. Well, now he has kind of to play this check. Rook f7, knight a4. But after queen c7, it appears, after the exchange of queens, that black is in the driving seat quite clearly. And Carlsen played here really well. He played b6. Now he chases the knight away, and bishop takes f6 is the normal reaction. The idea after bishop takes f6 to play knight e4, but still after king g7 we can conclude that black is on top here. He's gonna play bishop b7, put a rook on c8, and penetrate here in white's camp. Actually, he can go to c8, or perhaps even better to d8. Well, in any case, it looks better for black. What he played in the game is also good. B takes c5, perhaps even better, because now he's reinforcing his pawn on d4 with this pawn on c5, so that e4 becomes very serious and very real. Took on g7, took. Well, perhaps he should have played rook c1, c4, knight d2, bishop a6. Black is on top, of course. He's better, but perhaps it would have been better than the game. Knight d2, bishop b7, f6. He went to f8. He could have gone to f7 as well. Rook de1, rook e8, and knight e4. Well, it's always a question for black how to improve the position, how to increase the advantage, and here Carlsen took a good decision, I believe. He decided to swap these last two pieces, the light pieces, the bishop for the knight, on e4, and play c4. His pawns are more dangerous. His king is better placed because it's in front of the majority of white, so it's capable of blocking it, whereas the white king is very far from the action. g4, king b8, rook b8, sorry, and well, again an exchange. Rook takes e5, rook takes b2, and we have now two very strong passed pawns here connected again, and it's very tough to stop them. I think Caruana did a good job in time trouble to keep kind of Black's advantage to some minimum or limit. Rook d5, c3, rook d8, king f7, rook h8. It's quite interesting. He's going for the pawn, and of course if you play king g6, there is rook g8 coming. Not really what you want to do. So that's why he played rook b7, which is good. Takes, king g6, takes. Now the rook remains on c7, very strongly placed, and well, it looks as if Black is completely winning, but there is just in time king f2 here. Carlsen took his time. It's move 40. He was not in time trouble, contrary to Caruana. Kind of a problem for the American player, by the way. Also in Berlin at the candidates tournament, he was quite often in time pressure. Well, it didn't really have any consequence in Berlin, but here it's generally not advisable to go into time trouble too often. c2, that's actually the best continuation. Rook c1, d3, king e3, rook d7, threatening to push the d-pawn, so king d2 is forced, and now king takes f6, restoring the balance. 3 pawns each on the board. Of course, the black pawns much more dangerous, and the king is coming as well. Well, white has no choice. He has to try and push his own pawns as well. King e5 and rook f1. That's a good move, cutting out the king from this pawns here, and perhaps trying to give some checks here, as we're gonna see actually. So he went king d4, h5, rook e7, rook f4 check. Well, they repeated the moves here. King d5 a little bit, and of course Black playing for a win, going into the position king b3. And here actually Caruana kept on defending in the best possible way. He played rook b4 check, king takes a3, and rook c4. He has to stand behind the c pawn, the further pawn here, the c pawn. The rook has to be behind it. King b3, rook c8. And in this position Carlsen missed the win, even though he took a lot of time in this endgame, making sure that he was be able to find the right and the best path. But here he failed. He actually pushed his a pawn when the best move was to play rook h7, preventing the white pawns to move forward, at least for a while. An important while, because for instance, if white plays rook c6, trying to push the pawns now, there is king b2, and you can't play rook b6 here. So it's a bit tricky. Black is actually winning here, even though, well, it's not completely obvious yet. Well, perhaps the best continuation objectively is to take on d3. But after rook d7 check, the rook is back here, but forcing the white king to go away to the e file. Well, first of all, if king e2, rook d1 decides the game quite easily for Black. So he has to try king e4. And here, well, continuation, the key move is actually, well, not a5, but the key move, you could play the move before or even a bit later. First push your a pawn, but you can play this key move. It has to be played at some point. It's rook d8. Well, the main idea is that Black is actually going to win some tempi. After rook c7, for instance, he plays a4, and by standing on the 8th rank, well, white actually has to waste more time here, for instance, like this and a2, and this is going to be a win for Black. So basically after rook takes d8, c1, queen, well, in practice, Black certainly still has to be careful and find some good moves to try and convert his advantage, but you can see that g5 is already under attack now by the queen. Besides, there is also queen h1 to take h5, so threats, immediate threats to destroy the two pawns here. And Black, of course, has kept a pawn on a5, which is also important to ensure a win. So, well, the computer gives this line pretty quickly, and it's easy to condemn Carlsen for not seeing it, but in practice, these endgames are so complicated, and especially he has spent energy before that to reach this winning position. With the clock ticking, it's very complicated actually to find the best way, and it almost looks as if a5 is good too, but the problem is h6 is coming, and white is very quick as well. a4, look at this, g5, and if you play a3, I guess g6 is going to be good here, and there are going to be queens too. So not easy, of course, for black. Well, here actually probably Carlsen understood that he had missed something, and he decided to play rook e2 check, king takes d3, rook h2 g5, and here to give a draw by checking the king. Well, here he would have played king rook h3, and the draw would have been signed. So well, for this first game after the candidates tournament, when we now know that Caruana is the challenger of Magnus Carlsen, we can't really claim that Caruana impressed in this game, especially, well, his opening was a bit well, unpretentious, of course, but the problem is that Carlsen very quickly and with the black pieces managed to take an advantage in this game and outplayed Caruana. But the American showed great resilience, and in the end Carlsen failed to convert his advantage, which is quite uncharacteristic, even though he has been a bit more shaky with his technique in the past 2 years or so. So it's well, it's actually an interesting first encounter, but we can't really draw any conclusion yet. Of course, we are still very far from the match, which is going to take place in November. So both players haven't obviously yet started their preparation and do not think yet too much about the match. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if this is the case, please like it, and you can also subscribe to my channel. Thank you very much, and goodbye.